Okay, so I'm Alice, I guess, and I'm going to be talking about the November and December topic for PF, which is resolve the United States federal government should require technology companies to provide lawful access to encrypted communications. And so what I'm going to, this roadmap is kind of misleading, but I'm going to talk about just like the history of encrypted communications in the US and what that even means. So why is this a topic? Why is this controversial? And then some notes about other countries and what it looks like there. And then obviously talking about advantages and disadvantages and potentially just like how you could answer them or what I specifically thought of in answering them. So with the history, I'm going to start with the highlighted section, which is about end-to-end encryption. So the reason that we even have this topic is because some companies, for example, iMessage from Apple and Signal, use end-to-end encryption, which means that nobody except the sender and the receiver of a message can actually know what the message says. The reason that this is true is because there's essentially a public key and a private key. So the public key does this thing where the Apple can like encrypt your message, and the private key is only stored on like your device and the sender's device, so that only you and the sender can actually fully decrypt it. And when it's not fully decrypted, it's called ciphertext. And obviously, I don't know tons about how encryption actually works, but that's kind of like the basics of it. So Apple themselves do not have the private key, so they can't actually access your message. So for example, it's complicated because companies can't actually see what you're saying. So when the US government tries to get them and subpoenas them and is like, hey, we want to see what like you were talking to this other person about and whether this person was like committing a crime or something, it doesn't actually help because they issue the warrant, but the company doesn't have anything to give law enforcement. At best, they can just give them ciphertext, which is really not helpful at all. So that also makes it complicated because it means law enforcement can't do their jobs, but companies don't want to make things less secure and allow law enforcement to be able to see the information because if they do build what's called a back door or a front door, even this doesn't actually help them stay secure because a hacker might be able to find their way in through the back or front door, which are both terms that people use, but they're basically the same thing, to be able to just like find your data, which makes them less secure as a company. So companies don't want to do that and have been lobbying against these policies. So one example of this in action was in 2015 in the Apple versus FBI case. Essentially, there's like the terrorist attack at San Bernardino, and the FBI wanted to investigate the communications of the attacker. But the issue was because they used like iMessage, they couldn't get Apple to send them the information, which was a big problem because they wanted to obviously find out what was going on behind the scenes. They also couldn't brute force the person's phone because after like 10 tries or something, it erases all the data on the phone, which led to them getting a court order to Apple to try to get them to send them the information about what was going on. But Apple was just blatantly just flat out said no and was unwilling to give them any data, especially because they don't have the capability to. So the FBI wasn't able to access any of this information. So they were having a whole court battle, but the court did not actually have to resolve the issue because the FBI withdrew the case after they hired an Israeli company to hack the phone for them. So we never actually got court precedent on what can happen and such. So one of the biggest issues with this in many lawmakers' eyes is the Constitution, right? Because if you're able to just access anybody's phone, this could end up being an issue of both privacy and of self-incrimination. Because with privacy, if you are able to just access any communications, obviously you are violating a lot of people's privacy, which potentially violates the Fourth Amendment. So this is an especially relevant issue given if anybody, probably nobody, because debated the NSA topic from 2021. There was this whole thing with Edward Snowden, who was a whistleblower and basically said the NSA is spying on everybody. And this was like a huge thing in like I want to say 2011 or like 2012 or something like that. But that meant that people were just getting spied on and nobody liked that, obviously. And some people would say, well, if I'm not a criminal, why would I care about my privacy or about the FBI having access to my information? But it kind of goes back to things like the government being able to be just like this all-knowing like dictator kind of that has all of your information and has access to all of it, and a slippery slope almost that we'll get to when we talk about disads. Um, Another thing is self-incrimination. So the Fifth Amendment is like you can't testify against yourself, but some people aren't sure whether that also includes unlocking your own phone, which I think is kind of less relevant to this topic, but it's something that people have been discussing. So, about relevant US regulations, there have been a lot of them, but a lot of them have kind of faded out of usefulness. So, the CALEA from 1994 requires telecommunications carriers to design their equipment, facilities, and services to ensure they have built-in capability to comply with lawful surveillance orders. But because of end-to-end encryption, a lot of these companies can't comply with those orders, and they even don't count as carriers because they're kind of just companies that help facilitate you doing this communication. They're not actively like it's not like a phone company that is actively able to track your information. The Clipper ships in 1990 in the 1990s were another example of this. That was trying to the government was trying to promote the usage of this Clipper ships technology, which is essentially the company has your public key and another third party has the private key. So if the government has a warrant, they can then go ask for that private key and get the information, which never actually succeeded. They tried to promote it, but it was shut down around 1996 or 4 or something, which was a system called key escrow. And some people are still advocating for that today, advocating for other third parties like the ACLU to hold like the key so that the government can still ask them for it if needed. But this is also still unpopular for the same reasons, i.e., if somebody can still hack and take advantage of these vulnerabilities, it still exists, which still means that it's not secure. The SCA is the Stored Communications Act, which says that like service providers have to be able to provide the government's information when the government serves a warrant. But the issue with that one is again that that warrant may just give them ciphertext because the company doesn't have the information either. And these last two are both attempts by the government to pass things that stop end-to-end encryption, but actually didn't get passed. Yeah. So the LADA, or the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act, mandated first mandatory assistance, which means that all companies have to help the government. Second, no warrant-proof encryption, i.e., no more end-to-end encryption. Third, technical compliance, meaning that companies know they have the ability to unencrypt data. And fourth, penalties for non-compliance, meaning you get punished if you don't follow these things. It was introduced by Republican senators, but it faced backlash from technology companies, privacy advocates, and a lot of just like bipartisan legislators who want to protect privacy and cybersecurity. Generally, the same thing is true of the Earn It Act. I don't know what this one stands for, but basically they were trying to amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was actually one of our topics 2 years ago for January. And this was to try to avoid the proliferation of CSAM, or child sexual assault material, on their services by stopping them from encrypting that so that you could take it down. And we'll talk more about CSAM in another slide about the advantages, but it also did not pass for the same reasons as the act before, because companies lobbied against it and they thought it would be weaker for cybersecurity and privacy. So quickly on some other countries, Australia has the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Amendment, or TOLA, which has 3 tiers and it's like a whole complicated thing. But the most important part is the technical capability notices, which are compulsory orders that the Attorney General of Australia can issue to require a provider to build in a new technical capability to assist law enforcement. But the response has generally been negative, and the government has never used it. So we've never actually seen it inaction, so we don't actually know what's going on here. In the UK, they have the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, which is also known as the Snoopers Charter. So essentially, in the UK, you can also issue a technical capability notice to telecommunications officers to try to compel them to get you to decrypt things. More recently, the UK has sought to strengthen that with the Investigatory Powers Amendment Bill that would force companies to tell the government, if they're encrypting data. And essentially, that means that the government in the UK can now tell companies, hey, you can't encrypt your data because we need to be able to have that. The issue with that is that Britain has actually recently agreed to drop the backdoor requirement for Apple. Basically, they asked Apple to give them a backdoor in order to ensure that they could see the communications, and Apple just said no, and the British government backed down, and they were just like, okay, then we won't, which obviously kind of proves the difficulty of enforcing these mechanisms and kind of goes back to the San Bernardino case of FBI versus Apple, where we've never actually seen any of these policies enforced. Finally, in the EU, they've also been trying to move towards making it more difficult for government or for companies to protect the data. However, they have the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Requirement or something, which mandates data protection by design and by default, which almost basically mandates that everything is encrypted, which makes it very difficult for governments to snoop. However, a lot of lawmakers are talking about trying to get rid of it, or instead focusing on their own technical abilities to track hackers in other ways, i.e., they are trying to be able to hack into the systems of criminals instead of focusing on being able to make companies decrypt their data. So that's basically all the background. Basically, current regulations aren't great, and nobody has succeeded in compelling companies to decrypt things. So now let's talk about advantages. The AF ground on this topic is low-key just really bad because every reason comes down to crime, and so you'll struggle to find other advantages. So we'll talk about crime first. The four main categories, I would say, of crime that people talk about when it comes to encrypted communications are cartels, CSAM, terrorism, and then I came up with other because you never know what else. So with cartels, obviously they've been a big problem for a long time, and they use encrypted platforms to communicate with one another about drug trafficking, human trafficking, and a lot of this takes place obviously in Mexico. So the main issue with that is that the US government is unable to track down these communications, which could help them a lot. With CSAM, there's a lot of uncertainty because essentially child sexual assault material gets transmitted on these like end-to-end encrypted platforms, so the government has no ability to stop it, and a lot of abuse victims are unwilling to testify for various reasons, which makes it very hard to track down the perpetrators. This was also a very common argument on the Section 230 topic 2 years ago. Terrorism, we can look again at the San Bernardino case because there can both be the use of this being able to track these encrypted data for criminals that have already happened and for prevention in the future. The issue with that is that there's going to be a lot of data, which I'll get to in responses to these arguments about crime. And finally, obviously, there's other sources of crime, which could just basically be anything. If the government has reasonable suspicion, maybe they'll find somebody who committed murder or something. So overall, these basically are the main reason that people advocate for end-to-end encryption at all. We want to be able to track criminals because right now it is just a black box of what is going on with the criminals. So it's very difficult. However, obviously, a lot of these scenarios don't have great impact scenarios, right? For a lay judge, maybe cartels, CSAM, and terrorism, and other crimes are very compelling, but it's really hard to locate a good impact scenario on the app about cartels, etc., when we've had cartels be around for so long. And unfortunately, as dark as it is, it's difficult to find an impact scenario for something like CSAM, which makes these arguments less viable and makes the app more difficult to be on. These are the quick responses that I came up with off the top of my head. Generally, I don't think crime is a great argument because criminals will always be criminals, right? They can always locate illegal and foreign devices that don't have this end-to-end encryption like decrypting mandate on them, meaning that they can always find a way for themselves to still commit their crimes, i.e., if they're breaking the law anyway, why wouldn't they just break this law about encryption, right? That basically just applies to all of these arguments here. And specifically with cartels, we already know they have lots of resources, and terrorists as well, especially if they are foreign terrorists. It means that a lot of the time they'll be able to locate information from elsewhere in order to get their own devices. Specifically with cartels, we also see issues like bribery, right? So even if the US government is able to start tracking them, we can see that the cartels often bribe their way out of it, which can be seen by the fact that they've empirically hacked security systems, etc., and that there's a US government crackdown right now, but we still see cartels surviving. So you can spin the US government crackdown two ways as a response to cartels. You could both say that it means that cartels going away now, which means the app is unnecessary, but you could also say that it means that even despite the best technology being used and people being able to track down many leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, which was recently busted, we still see that cartels are surviving, and they'll just shift and adapt even if we pass the app. Um, on CSAM, there's some evidence about other platforms currently being used, which goes back to like the illegal or foreign devices, and also just platforms that don't have end-to-end encryption right now, like Instagram and Facebook, I believe. Like I've seen articles that say that those platforms are currently being used, which means that even if we're able to decrypt stuff, it's not going to end up reducing this at all. With terrorism, like I said earlier, foreign terrorists can obviously get to that data, but also there's issues of data overload, which also applies to generic crime because there's so much data out there that it's really difficult to locate terrorism before it happens, which means that terrorism prevention obviously isn't a great impact because the impact scenario will have already triggered. So it's not really good. And with generic crimes, I would say just getting warrants in order to search people's devices would probably be very difficult to do. Misinformation, I think this one is a bit less compelling because it's like, how are you stopping misinformation now without end-to-end encryption? Even without end-to-end encryption. But there are articles that say end-to-end encryption does facilitate misinformation and a lack of fact-checking because companies can't do the things that like putting up like factual information on posts, etc. So the impacts of this might be healthcare, things like vaccine misinformation and mistrust in healthcare professionals that are already getting worsened by RFK Jr., which might mean that there's less trust and investment in vaccine development with like a pandemic's impact. On climate change, I know people mentioned, like talked about this on the Section 230 topic too, but the US is like already behind targets. So more misinformation would push us to not passing those policies, thus being able to check back on misinformation, passes better policies, and obviously the US can model for other countries. And politics, I don't think that this would be particularly compelling, but voters could be misinformed and it could change their minds, which is kind of going back to both of the two previous arguments. But overall, I don't know how viable this argument is, given a few problems that I thought of with it immediately. The first is echo chambers. People who experience the same misinformation that we already know, that people who learn misinformation on end-to-end encrypted platforms, i.e. messaging forums, probably are already leaning towards that kind of misinformation and probably already believe it to some extent, which means that it doesn't really change their information a lot. And second is enforcement, because obviously you can't stop people from saying misinformation just because it's wrong due to the First Amendment. You can try to provide resources to fact check it, but again, end-to-end encryption is mostly just people communicating with one another, which makes that a lot more difficult. So with healthcare specifically, the pandemic's impact would definitely not be great because some people would still get vaccines. Other countries can develop vaccines. And even if just the US is able to pass this end-to-end and like get rid of end-to-end encryption, people in other countries can still get vaccinated, which overall means to me that like this healthcare impact isn't great. Maybe it would be a good lay argument, but my concerns above about echo chambers and enforcement probably still apply there. on climate change, I also think that the same issues apply, and the fact that there are other reasons we don't pass climate change bills, right? Because the Trump administration obviously does not want to do a lot of bolstering of climate policy, and there are lobbying efforts from fossil fuel companies against this type of thing. I don't think voters being more informed would be a super big change. With politics, I think the only scenario that the voters could really have an impact in is the midterms, but the midterms are very far away, and voters care more about voting along party lines and about their actual economic conditions. So I would say that it probably actually doesn't influence voters much, which makes most of these arguments not viable. So overall, I think that the AF is not great on this topic. There's basically only one argument, which sure, it could have a lot of impacts, but it's also very difficult to make sure that you are actually able to stop crime because criminals will just do other things and find other devices. But now we'll talk about the disads on this topic. The first thing is innovation, right? These companies have incentives to not innovate new cybersecurity technology if they know that whatever cybersecurity they're doing, they'll still have to provide a backdoor to the government in order to open up and get that information to the government. That means that they'll probably, with these regulations, not be willing to provide more cybersecurity, pushing the US behind on cybersecurity. The other side constraint of that is foreign competition, right? There might be concerns about these companies then fleeing to other countries because they want to have a more lax environment, which means that it might hurt US hedge in cybersecurity overall. That could have an interesting impact, but I'm not sure about how much cybersecurity influences how much the US is the technological leader in general. More issues with this innovation arguments are first, there are obviously incentives for the companies to protect themselves from cybersecurity, right? They know that they have this weakness. They will innovate solutions to that weakness to make sure hackers can't get to them because they don't want to get hacked in themselves and they don't want their reputation to get damaged by consumers knowing that they got hacked. Additionally, consumers will probably want to choose the products that have the best cybersecurity. So even though they probably don't know a lot, if they see that companies are getting hacked, they'll choose a different product. So this could even turn into an AF argument, I guess, because you could say it will incentivize companies to do better cybersecurity. But overall, I would say either way, the impact to that is very marginal because because we've seen cyber attacks before, but they've had very limited scope of impacts. With foreign competition, companies are probably incentivized to stay within the US because of just like the environment of the US and how the US is like the global leader in a lot of technology and compartmentalization, right? They're always going to want the US consumer base, so they'll get rid of end-to-end encryption within the US, but they can keep innovating in their technologies elsewhere, which kind of goes back to a strange argument about the enforcement of these issues. Like, do all of the technologies that companies make have to have these backdoors or just the parts being sold in the US? Or does it just apply as a blanket law to all companies based in the US? Presumably, I would say all technology being used in the US, which would mean that companies can still develop their software elsewhere that does not require getting rid of end-to-end encryption. The next is another big concern by a lot of companies, which is privacy. There's personal privacy and obviously the implications for democracy and people's rights. If your stuff is not being encrypted anymore, it makes it much easier for hackers to get your information, which not only could lead you to be a victim of a ransomware attack where you have to pay a lot of money for them not to infect your computer for a virus, but it could also mean that the government overreaches and looks too much into your information like they did with the NSA in past years. So obviously that is a big concern for a lot of people, and it leads into the idea of democracy and rights. Because if the government is willing to look into all of our information, what happens if they want to censor us? Or if they want to do something with that information without a warrant? So that kind of starts meaning democratic backsliding. And it also models to other countries that it's okay to snoop on your citizens, which probably isn't a precedent that the US wants to set, especially in a term where we have Trump, who's already getting rid of a lot of the democratic safeguards that we've had in the past, which makes this like all the more concerning of an issue. I think this is an interesting impact, but it's hard to quantify how much democracy backslide is needed to trigger any sort of democracy impact scenario, but it could definitely be a compelling argument in front of lay judges. The issues that I thought of with this argument is that, first of all, warrants will prevent government overreach because a lot of the enforcement comes with governments issuing warrants and then looking into your data, not them just always snooping on your data, which obviously would be really bad. And also that there's not a lot of reason for hackers to target individuals, though admittedly that's not true because they can make a lot of money off of just scamming individual, like people who are decently well off. Specifically with democracy and rights, I would say that NSA probably thumped that, especially with the Edward Snowden regulations, i.e., if we were going to be a bad model, we already have been given how intrusive the NSA is, and that China already models this. There are other big countries that, if you are a country that is looking to backslide, you would model off of them, not off of the US, right? If you're a country that is looking to be a democracy, then you're probably still not going to do this either way. So the argument is kind of like iffy there. Next is cybersecurity. This is a big concern for a lot of people because obviously, first of all, like you don't want major companies to get hacked. I would say this gets split up into the government, which is like, what if our nukes get hacked? And then like the grid, which self-explanatory, like what if all of our electricity gets put out? Companies, like we could see that they get hacked by ransomware. And then personally, you could get hacked easily, which I already covered under privacy, but it kind of falls under both. With the government, this comes down to a definition debate about what communications are. There is an argument to be made that communications includes sending data between things. So then if there has to be a backdoor in that data, obviously bad actors could interfere with our satellites, our nuclear weapons, which would be a very bad thing. The issue with this is that I don't think that that's actually true. Encrypted communications is probably just like actual people talking to one another, not a satellite talking to like a nuclear weapon. Um, Grid, this is the same thing. Obviously, there are a lot of grid impact cards that you can read, but is it a form of encrypted communications? Who knows? Companies specifically, I guess this impact makes sense. The thing is, we've already seen ransomware attacks happen, and the number of companies using encrypted that could get ransomware by an encrypted communications link doesn't really seem like a lot to me, and but there's like no real impact to that. And personal is the same as privacy. So again, here are my thoughts on that either way. I'd say companies may strengthen security, which goes back to the cybersecurity innovation argument that I talked about earlier. And then you can obviously read impact defense to arguments like the government and the grid, which like the grid is compartmentalized. The whole US isn't going to get like killed of its grid. And companies have an incentive to protect themselves. And also, you could just use foreign companies to make your data so then you don't get hacked, and the impact is still weird. So the issue with most of these cybersecurity arguments is that I don't think they have much of a actual impact that you can say. For lay judges, you might be able to say things like your personal cybersecurity, companies getting ransomware, that could just be bad. But again, this topic is a much more like geared towards the lay. Finally, politics. I think there are some interesting things to be said about politics. PC, Trump might have to use a lot of PC to pass this policy. And I guess you could make that even an advantage if you're saying Trump policy is bad. The plan has been very unpopular in the past, as we've seen by the fact that the past acts, like the LAEDA and the Earn It Act, did not get passed, and they both faced bipartisan opposition. With lobbying, obviously tech companies have lots of money and are trying to influence government all the time. So they could get the government to make alternative concessions that you could read a dissent about, or they could even get the government to not enforce the regulations, like we've seen in the UK, which might lead into some defensive app. And then there's party politics. Obviously, this is just like the Democrats will hate the Republicans for doing this, and then they won't let the Republicans pass bills, and they'll delay floor time, and there's stalemates, like classic politics. The main issues I've thought of to this argument are first, like we're in a shutdown right now. I don't know when we won't be in a shutdown, but if we're in a shutdown, I don't think there are many other bills that could get passed right now, which doesn't really make it so it doesn't really make the politics arguments make any sense. On political capital, I'd say Trump has a pretty decent hold on Republicans right now, and since Republicans are in the majority in the House and in the Senate, it probably doesn't matter. Um, and same thing with party politics, but I'll talk about it right now, is that by it is bipartisan that people don't like this stuff. So it doesn't really seem to me like there would be a lot of party animosity or animosity like in general, just because people have generally agreed that they don't like this. And finally is lobbying. I'd say tech companies are probably already lobbying for all of the things that they want now. It's not like this the plan is going to uniquely make them lobby more, which means that overall it's not going to have a huge impact. I think that obviously, well, I'm done. I don't have a last slide, so I'm just gonna yap a bit. But I think this topic has a very limited scope. It's geared towards the neg, but even in the neg, the impacts are not great. Um, Obviously, I think my opinions will change on it as I debate this topic more and as everybody develops more arguments, writes more arguments, etc. But right now, this topic is really kind of just a lay topic that has been hashed over again and again with very few unique arguments and very little interesting subject matter. But the arguments that do exist, if you want to say them on the lay, are viable. That's it.
Yay, thank you. I think that well, first of all, thank you, Alice, very, very much for giving the lecture. And I think that the Zoom is going to run out of time any second now. So for the people on here, feel free to Slack me and I can text Alice or DM the Win Instagram. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for coming and thank you, Alice, for giving the lecture.
Thank you, guys.